Okay, so let's dive into something really quite incredible today. The natural world. It's this huge interconnected system, isn't it? Plants, animals, everything linked.
Absolutely. And, humans are right in the thick of it. Our activities are constantly shaping that picture.
They really are. And when you look at all the source material you brought us, the articles, notes, even that audio clip, it paints a picture of this immense complexity. Flora, fauna, agriculture.
It's a lot to take in, definitely. Covering so many different aspects of how life works and how we interact with it.
Right. So our goal for this deep dive really is to unpack all that, to sort through the material, pull out the key facts, the important insights, and get a really solid understanding of the main ideas in the language used.
Exactly. We'll try to make sense of it together, like finding the main threads in a really intricate tapestry. We'll look at the vocabulary, the examples, the bigger picture.
Perfect. Consider this your guided tour. Let's get started. Where do the sources begin?
Well, they seem to start with the fundamentals, the basic building blocks, you could say. Lots of vocabulary right off the bat for describing plants and animals, kind of setting the scene.
Yeah, that makes sense, giving us the tools to talk about it. So for plants, we're seeing words like branch, twig, root.
Trunk, petal, thorn, the physical bits and pieces.
And for animals, things like fur, hide, scales, feathers.
Right. Paw, claw, beak as well. And interestingly, terms like coat and horn.
Oh yeah, coat meaning like the fur or feathers on an animal.
Exactly. And horn, obviously, on an animal's head. It shows how specific the language can be.
What about the types of plants and animals actually mentioned in the material?
Well, there are general terms like vegetation, shrub, bush, and then things relevant to us like crop and weed.
Okay. Any specific examples?
Yeah, a few flowers like rose, tulip, daisy.
Yeah.
And on the animal side, the meerkat comes up, also the fox, rabbit, and the cane toad. We'll definitely talk more about that one later.
Ugh, the meerkat. That audio clip you shared was fascinating. It's a great way to illustrate a couple of really key concepts the sources bring up: habitat and diet.
It really is. It gives such a vivid picture of how a species fits its environment. The clip mentions they're found in the semi-arid plains of southern Africa.
Right. Open country, not woodland or thick bushes.
Exactly. They avoid that.
Yeah.
And for shelter, they dig burrows with those, powerful front legs. Or if the ground's too hard, they'll use rock crevices. Very adaptable.
And their diet, it wasn't just insects, was it?
No, mostly insects, spiders, snails, that sort of thing. But the clip highlighted that they also eat occasionally small rodents, lizards.
And even snakes and scorpions. I remember that bit.
Yeah. Pretty amazing, right? They rely on a really keen sense of smell to find food, even dangerous prey like that.
Wow. That really shows how specialized they are for their specific niche. It's incredible. Now, the sources also bring in some important terms about where species belong, right? Like native, introduced.
Yes, exactly. Native, introduced, endemic, local, and exotic species. That distinction becomes really crucial when we start looking at human impact.
Because we don't just live alongside nature, we actively change it. Which leads us to agriculture, right? That's a big focus.
A very big focus. The sources talk about the core activities: to grow, cultivate, and plant. Basic farming actions.
But growing crops inevitably brings challenges. Pests seem to be a major theme.
Oh, absolutely. A constant battle for farmers, according to the material. And it details different ways humans try to control these pests. Broadly, two approaches.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is, well, the chemical route, using pesticides, chemical sprays.
And the sources seem pretty critical of that.
They are. They really highlight the downsides. Things like destroying the environment, harming the living spaces of other animals.
Right. They mentioned toxins building up.
Exactly. Building up over time, potentially poisoning other animals, upsetting the whole ecological balance. And there's another problem. Pests can actually become resistant to the sprays.
So the sprays become less effective over time.
Precisely, making control even harder in the long run. So yeah, significant drawbacks are pointed out.
Okay, so if chemical pesticides have these issues, what's the alternative presented?
Well, that leads to the second approach: biological methods or biological control.
Biological control. So using nature against nature.
Kind of, yeah. The idea is you introduce a natural enemy, like a predator, or maybe a specific disease that targets the pest, usually by eating it.
Sounds more natural, maybe safer.
On the surface, yes. But the sources give us some really powerful case studies that show, well, it's not always that simple. The outcomes can vary wildly.
This is where those specific examples come in handy, like the moth and the toad you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Let's look at those. First, a success story highlighted in the material: the Cactoblastis moth introduced in Australia.
Okay, what was it supposed to control?
It was brought in to deal with the prickly pear cactus. Now, the prickly pear was itself an introduced species,
Ah, so an introduced species causing problems.
a massive problem. It had spread like wildfire. But the Cactoblastis moth larvae feed on prickly pear.
And it worked?
It did. The material describes it as being very successful. The moths basically wiped out most of the prickly pear. So a win for biological control there.
Okay, clear success.
Yeah.
But then there's the other side of the coin, the cane toad, also in Australia.
Yes, the cane toad.
Yeah.
Introduced with a specific goal to control the cane beetle, which was damaging sugarcane crops.
That didn't eat the beetle.
Nope, not really. The results are described in the sources as catastrophic, extremely bad, unsuccessful. That's the language used.
Catastrophic. Why? What happened instead?
Well, the cane toad itself is poisonous. It doesn't control the beetle, but it did thrive. It spread incredibly fast. And because it's toxic, native predators that tried to eat it, mammals, reptiles, they died.
Oh, wow. So it actually harmed native wildlife instead of helping with the pest.
Massively. It led to declines in many native Australian species.
Yeah.
So you have one introduced species intended to control another, but it ends up becoming an even bigger problem itself.
That's a stark contrast to the moth example. It really shows the risks, doesn't it? Trying to manipulate these complex systems.
It absolutely does. It highlights the unpredictability. You introduce what you think is one simple fix, but the ripple effects through that ecological web can be huge and unforeseen.
And the sources don't stop there, do they? They talk about other human impacts beyond just these specific biological control attempts.
Right. It broadens out to discuss other introduced or exotic species.
Yeah.
The fox and the rabbit in Australia are mentioned specifically.
Introduced by humans, too.
Yes. And the impact is described as, again, disastrous for native Australian animals, competition for food, predation.
Disastrous. That word keeps coming up. Is there any sense of the scale of the damage?
There is, actually. The material gives a pretty shocking statistic. It says that since the introduction of certain exotic species, something like 250 native Australian species have become extinct, endangered, or vulnerable.
250? That's staggering. Can you quickly remind us what those terms mean?
Sure. Extinct means gone forever, no longer exists. Endangered means at very high risk of becoming extinct in the wild. And vulnerable means facing a high risk of extinction in the medium-term future. Basically, all very bad news for those species.
Linked directly to these introductions. Wow, okay. Does the material touch on more modern approaches to dealing with pests or changing nature?
It does briefly mention modern agricultural techniques, specifically crops whose genes have been scientifically changed.
Ah, genetically modified crops or GMOs.
Exactly. And while they're sometimes developed for pest resistance, the material notes that their long-term impact on the ecological balance is still, well, controversial. It's not presented as a simple fix without potential issues.
So still unknowns there. What about other disruptions, not just introducing species or changing crops?
Yes, other human activities get mentioned. Things like chemical spills are given as an example of something that can completely destroy the balance of nature in an area. Accidental, but devastating.
Okay, so we've gone from the basic vocabulary, the meerkat example, through agriculture, the pest control stories, good and bad, to these wider impacts like species loss and GMOs. How do the sources tie this all together? What's the bigger picture?
Well, it seems to circle back to this fundamental idea of nature. The material talks about it in broad terms, human nature, things being a natural process, but also, importantly, the idea that we need to take care of nature.
Right, and that concept of ecological balance seems central.
Absolutely, that delicate interplay between everything, plants, animals, the land, air, water, all the examples we've discussed, the moth, the toad, the pesticides, the spills, they all show how human actions can knock that balance off kilter.
There was one line in the material that really stood out, something like, man is said to be the most dangerous creature.
Yes, that's a powerful statement. It definitely makes you pause.
And when you think about the cane toad, the 250 species at risk, the potential impact of widespread chemical use, you can see why someone might say that based on the evidence presented.
Exactly. It speaks to our unique capacity as humans to alter the planet on a massive scale, often, as the examples show, with unintended and negative consequences. It seems to reflect on our role and maybe our foresight or lack thereof.
It's a sobering thought. It really forces you to consider our place within this whole system, not just as observers, but as major actors.
A very key theme running through all the source material, I'd say.
Okay. So, just to recap this deep dive then, we started with the basics, the language to describe plants and animals, using the meerkat as a specific example of habitat and diet.
Uh-huh. Then we moved into human interaction, mainly through agriculture. We looked at pest control, the chemical approach with its environmental costs,
Right, and the biological approach, which gave us that stark contrast between the successful Cactoblastis moth controlling prickly pear.
and the catastrophic failure of the cane toad, which ended up harming native wildlife instead of controlling the intended pest.
And then we broadened out to the wider impacts other disastrous introductions like the fox and rabbit, the shocking number of species lost or endangered, the controversies around GM crops, and other disruptions like chemical spills.
Tying it all back to that core idea of ecological balance and the significant, often damaging role humans play.
Absolutely. I think the main takeaway from digging into all this material is just how interconnected everything in the natural world is, and how our actions, even well-intentioned ones, can have really complex and far-reaching effects.
Definitely. Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe ponder. If the sources suggest that humans can be the most dangerous creature, what does that really imply about our responsibility towards the natural world moving forward?
Yeah, what does that mean for how we act? And maybe what part of this deep dive sparked your curiosity the most? Perhaps something you'd want to look into further yourself.